Welcome to the Leather Lounge, a weekly show recorded live every Tuesday where we explore the latest innovations in the Bitcoin ecosystem. From DeFi and dApps to digital art, we bring you in-depth conversations with developers, artists, and community leaders who are shaping the future. Whether you're here to learn about cutting-edge projects or to deepen your understanding of blockchain basics and decentralization, Leather is your go-to source for all things Bitcoin. Content shared on this podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only. It does not constitute financial, investment, or legal advice. The views and opinions expressed are those of the host and guests and do not reflect the official policy or position of any other agency, organization, or company. We encourage you to conduct your own research and consult with a qualified professional before making any financial decisions. All right, hello and welcome back to the Leather Lounge. I am your host, Sean Longstreet, and today we are talking about Bitcoin adoption with Jason Meyer. Jason is the author of A Progressive's Case for Bitcoin, A Path Toward a More Just, Equitable, and Peaceful World, published in 2023. Jason brings an underrepresented perspective to Bitcoin by framing it through a progressive lens, a viewpoint that challenges the typical libertarian-leaning narrative in the space. In his book, Jason argues that Bitcoin aligns with progressive values by empowering marginalized communities, offering financial sovereignty to the unbanked, and providing a decentralized alternative to the traditional banking system. He also addresses environmental FUD, making the case that Bitcoin mining actually drives the development and proliferation of renewable energy sources. So today we're going to explore how Bitcoin can transcend political divisions, why grassroots education might be the key to long-term adoption, and how recent political shifts like Trump's alignment with Bitcoin are influencing the optics and adoption of Bitcoin. Jason is one of the most thoughtful and influential voices in the Bitcoin space, so I'm super excited to get his take on how we as Bitcoiners can shape the narrative and drive broader adoption. It's a conversation you definitely don't want to miss. So thanks for being here with us, everyone, today. And Jason, welcome to the lounge.
I appreciate it, Sean. Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Definitely. All right. So rather than rehash a lot of the main talking points from the book and from your many fantastic podcast appearances, maybe you can just give us an update of what you're up to now that you are back in the classroom, literally right now. You're back to mining fiat, as we say, and how do you reflect on your time out of the classroom during your sabbatical?
Yeah, so last year I was lucky enough to have a sabbatical. So that was a year off to promote the book and to educate people about Bitcoin. And I didn't have any work responsibilities at all, which was really fascinating and wonderful. It allowed me to do a lot of traveling and a lot of talking and a lot of just sort of promotion of Bitcoin and the book, but primarily just sort of the benefits of Bitcoin. This year, starting in September, I've been back to work full time, so regular teacher job. And that takes up a lot of time and energy, of course. That was kind of the main reason behind trying to get the sabbatical in the first place, right? I wanted to give the book and sort of the ideas behind it enough room to promote and to work on, because that was going to take a lot of time. So I've been in the classroom since September. This whole school year, I've been loving it. I think it's great to be back. I tell people that being a high school math teacher was sort of my childhood dream, and I get to live it. So I'm happy about that. And I've been doing a little bit of stuff with Bitcoin here and there, right? Trying to promote the book and trying to talk about it. I think that I've been answering a lot of questions in my own community and meeting, especially with students who know that I've written a book and are interested about Bitcoin and learning more. But it's definitely sort of taken a backseat to my full-time sort of mining fiat job, right? I feel like it's a good spot for me to be in right now, but happy to sort of still have this connection to the Bitcoin community and try to sort of proliferate the education and the expansion and the adoption and all of those things. But it just feels a lot different when you're on break from work for a whole year.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
As you, like I said, as you reflect on that time away, are there some standout conversations where you helped, offer that bridge to progressives to help understand Bitcoin? Any key insights or moments that you still remember?
Yeah, I mean, I think probably the biggest moment for me on during the sabbatical was kind of one of the last things that I did, which was, take the stage at Bitcoin 2024 with two different Democratic Congress people who are, pro Bitcoin and very interested in sort of being part of the community and understanding it. So when I took the stage with Ro Khanna at Bitcoin 2024 in July in Nashville, it was the morning that Trump was going to speak. So it was kind of like at the conference. So it was kind of like this weird moment where I'm on stage. I'm sitting with like an elected U.S. representative who's here, talking to me about Bitcoin and sort of the ideas and principles behind the book and how Democrats can use Bitcoin to further their agenda and make the world a better place. And the audience was almost exclusively made up of people who were there to see Trump because the security involved in getting into like the main room was so intense that you had to kind of line up much earlier in the day. So it was kind of a weird experience to be on stage talking to a Democrat and talking about Bitcoin last July, and also know that the entire, the thousands of people in the room that are mostly there to see Trump later in the day, and they're just sort of tolerating my conversation. But I think that was a big moment for me to realize, wow, this is a little bit bigger than maybe I thought, and there actually we might be making some inroads with some elected representatives and to first generally just some progressive and left of center people in general. So.
Okay, good. In our pre-show conversation yesterday, you had a really good take on the top-down approach that we seem to have taken as Bitcoiners. And if you could tell us about that, and then on the other side, what the more bottom-up maybe more sustainable approach could be?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I really like about Bitcoin is sort of this decentralized opposition to authority, like bottom up grassroots approach is sort of one of the things that drew me to Bitcoin. And it's been interesting with Trump's support of Bitcoin, and we just recently have the strategic, Bitcoin reserve executive order coming out. It just seems like a lot of the principled Bitcoiners that I, learned from and got to know throughout my experience seem to be adopting more of like a top-down appeal to authority kind of vantage point, which is surprising in some ways. Um, but I feel like the the adoption of Bitcoin by governments is, many people say, well, this is inevitable. If you want Bitcoin to be this world currency or, worldwide adoption, then eventually we knew governments were going to buy into it and hold it or, use it, whatever the case is. And I get that. I think that that's probably true that like government adoption of Bitcoin is inevitable if we want to achieve sort of the goals that I set out in my book and that many people in the Bitcoin community espouse. But on this time frame and with this cast of characters and in this way doesn't necessarily mean like, inevitable doesn't mean it has to happen how we're seeing it, right? So, and, an explicit sort of transactional approach to a divisive political figure where you have somebody, a very select number of people making huge donations to Trump during the campaign. Trump gets elected. He's keeping his campaign promise and making this strategic reserve. And, there's a lot of uncertainty about which kind of, cryptocurrencies are going to be in this reserve. And is it really going to happen? And is he going to kind of pull back, like he has with a couple of his other policies? There's a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of sort of not knowing what comes next, and it's quite literally just top down, right? We're going to get the president of the United States or the most viable candidate for president of the United States on board with us. They're going to make policies and dictate sort of like what the country's stance on Bitcoin is. And I just don't think that's a sustainable way to go about it, right? Like, first of all, we know executive orders last as long as the executive in charge, right? So if all of our progress as Bitcoiners is being made through executive order, and we're not courting the left, like we're not sort of like protecting our left flank as Bitcoiners, then we know all of that progress can be wiped away just as fast as it came. And I think that I would just try to promote this idea that maybe we start with the voters. Maybe we try to convince people who are more left-leaning, like Bitcoin can solve some of the problems that they see in the world, which I really feel like it can. Speak their language a little bit. Start to see an adoption among a group of people that we haven't really seen a massive adoption from, and then let them put pressure on the politicians from the bottom up, right? Instead of saying, all right, well, we're going to find, $500 million to donate to your campaign because we know a lot of rich crypto people, just say, our people aren't going to vote for you if you don't support reasonable Bitcoin legislation. And I think the challenge with that approach is that if we wanted to go that road, then you're not talking about Bitcoin being like a key presidential election issue like it was this year until 8 or 12 years from now, because it takes time and to do it right, and you build a strong coalition of support that spans different political identities and different political factions and different kinds of people. That's how you make sort of Bitcoin adoption robust. And really, I'll pause in a minute, but I just want to say, like, I think it's great that Bitcoin like is being adopted by governments, and that's inevitable. But I would have loved for them to come begging us instead of us begging them. I think that would have been the right way for it to happen.
Yeah, it is very antithetical to the principles of decentralization of Bitcoin, right? To have America's Bitcoin strategy, it's rather centralized. I mean, we could say, right? Do you think it's net positive to have this executive order right now?
I don't know, and I don't want to be sort of like anything Trump does, I'm going to naturally be against it. Like, I don't know that it's all positive or all negative. And it's a good question. Like, is it a net negative? Is it a net positive? Um, I think that we don't know until we let it play out a little bit. Maybe there's gonna be some what is it, tax neutral accumulation or something like that, right? So we'll see what happens. I think that I will say I have a fear, which is there's people who are already into Bitcoin and we've already won them over and they understand the power and the beauty of Bitcoin. We don't need to sort of preach to them anymore. And all of the people left to sort of promote Bitcoin and orange pill and convince them that this is a tool that can be used to make the world a better place. A lot of them are going to see this as just not like a real important moment in Bitcoin history. They're just going to see this as another sort of gimmick that Trump is pulling off. And you can see that in some of the left-leaning media publications that have already come out about this, right? So, and Bitcoiners are going to be quick to, well, have fun staying poor and like, well, if you're going to ignore Bitcoin, it's your own fault. But, the truth is like, where's the next 100 million people or a billion people who adopt Bitcoin coming from? Like, where is your next 10x pump coming from if we don't have adoption and people aren't using the technology? And it just seems a little bit short-sighted to say, well, either you're going to get in with what Trump is doing or you're not, when we know just whether or not you agree with him, the truth is he's a very divisive political figure. So if it's coming top down and it's your point of being centralized is exactly right. Like one of the beauties of decentralization is that it's hard to take something away. It's hard to stop it. It's hard to stifle it. And when it just happens in a centralized way and say, oh well, we have a strategic Bitcoin reserve, and it happened because one person used one pen to sign a piece of paper. Well, that's not a robust system, right? Like that's not something that's gonna last. So what I would like to see, not that we get what we want, but is a broad coalition of support for a strategic Bitcoin reserve, and then it happens, and then there's not really a danger of it going away because somebody else is elected to be president. So I think that that's the key. Is it a net positive? We'll have to see. My concern is it's just going to turn a bunch of people off from Bitcoin who are going to see Trump involved and not even give it a second look. And that doesn't kill Bitcoin. Obviously, Bitcoin will be just fine, but sort of adoption among the people that I care about and the people of the United States in general can be set back, 10, 15, 20 years because of that. And that I think that's the worst case scenario, and I would hate to see that happen.
Yeah, for sure. What are some of when we're talking about like some of the positive conversations, like the success stories, when did it work for you? Whether that's coworkers at school, maybe extended family members, what were I guess like there's the element of like, what are the tools that you're using, but also you have to have some element personally of being open-minded, because I think a lot of people right now, especially on the left, who are probably feeling like they're kind of licking their wounds from the election.
Mm-hmm.
Like you mentioned, they're just grouping Bitcoin into it's a Trump thing, and I don't like anything about Trump, and therefore Bitcoin is bad. So
Right.
there's like not a lot of nuance. And I mean, one thing that we are witnessing in the country is that people are just so strongly divided, and they don't really have the inspiration or the wherewithal to think, okay, rather than making blanket statements about the other side or one person, you can pull out things that are good about an individual, right? Like, can we have a nuanced conversation? So what did some of those nuanced conversations look like for you?
Yeah, I mean, the book is sort of a compilation of like the best hits, right? Like what works with a progressive audience in terms of conversations, and sort of each one of those became a chapter in the book. I will say, like, before I get into that, though, I'll speak to your other point, which is I think super important. Like, we're not having a nuanced approach. People are just sort of lumping in Bitcoin with everything that Trump does. And it's just important to understand why that's happening, right? People are overloaded. People have a lot of news coming at them every day. If you're on the left side of the political spectrum, you see a lot of bad news coming at you every day, just a ton of things that Trump is doing that you don't like. Or even if we say, well, the media is telling you that you shouldn't like them. But I think genuinely speaking, like people aren't really digging a lot of the things that are coming out of the Trump administration. It's just sort of a fire hose of information. And when you have a scenario like that, human beings are really good at coming up with patterns and developing heuristics. And a lot of sort of shortcuts that people use are really useful in terms of their thinking, because otherwise you'd just be paralyzed with like information overload. And so, I made this point the other day, which is, if you think about something that's complicated and something that's about money and something that's on the internet, and you just dismiss it as a scam, you're going to be right 99.9% of the time, because that's probably true. And it might not be worth your energy to actually invest 100 hours studying why Bitcoin is the thing that's not part of the 99.9%.
Mm.
And so it's a big ask to say somebody who's like working two jobs or having trouble putting food on the table or has never learned anything about sort of monetary policy or the history of finance or anything like that, to start from scratch and understand why Bitcoin is important. And for a lot of people, not everybody, but for a lot of people in my target audience, if you say, all right, well, now I have something that's complicated and something that's about money and something that's on the internet and Trump is supporting it, that now we're talking about, well, 99.99% of the time, I would be totally correct to just never think about it again. And I can't blame somebody who takes that viewpoint, right? So like, this is the challenge I find myself in the space, trying to educate people. Like, how do I get somebody to have an open mind about the 0.01%, right? And it's not easy. And so I won't pretend like, oh yeah, I have the answer. I think that it was a little bit easier to have open-minded conversations a year and a half ago, right? I think
Yeah.
that where it was just sort of like, okay, well, this is a weird thing. I know you're the Bitcoin guy. I have a question. I think it doesn't work because of this. What do you have to say, right? Or something like that. And those conversations would go really well. I think that what I've always sort of preached um, in the Bitcoin space, and this is just my perspective of being a teacher, like a career long teacher, is to say you got to meet people where they are. And for Bitcoin to really hit home for people, you have to understand what is it that they really care about that they think isn't going well in the world. And just like conservative people, progressive people have a long list. Like, here are the things that are happening in the world that I don't think should be going that way, and this is what I'm upset about. And if you can take that issue that they really care about and frame it through a Bitcoin lens, and to say, I know you think you understand where that problem is coming from, and you're not wrong, but let's look at it one layer deeper, and let's think about how the money that we use contributes to that problem and is interwoven into that problem. And here's how Bitcoin could potentially be a solution, right? You don't speak in absolutes like Bitcoin fixes everything. Just say like Bitcoin is probably one step in coming up with a solution to this problem. Just meet people where they are, and that goes well, right? So I feel like there were a lot of false starts I've had with coworkers and friends. This gets back to your original question, like what are the things that actually work? There are arguments that I made in support of Bitcoin with people that I thought would be a home run, knockout, totally. Now they're going to get it after I say this one sentence, and it just fell flat. And they just had to keep trying, right? So it's like, well, if you're not into like helping the environment, or you don't understand that banks are ruining people's lives, then maybe it's financial inclusion in some other country where women are repressed or something like that. That's the thing that speaks to
Mm.
you. So then you kind of figure out what it is that speaks to different people and what it is that they really care about, and then or what are the concerns that they have about Bitcoin itself, and you just address those as they go. And so, like, the book that I wrote, Progressive's Case for Bitcoin, is 10 chapters of just that, right? Like, here's a 10 different arguments that I can make and try to really get through to people. And if you don't wake up every morning really concerned about sort of, if it's like the size of the federal government isn't the thing that gets you up in the morning, then maybe it's banks, or maybe it's sort of financial inclusion, maybe it's the environment. All of those kinds of things kind of have a Bitcoin lens to look at it through. And that's what I've been trying to do. So the short answer is it depends on what the person cares about. And to teach somebody something, you have to know how to make a connection. And that's what I try to do, whether it's in a math classroom or whether it's about Bitcoin.
Yeah, exactly. You're so perfectly suited for this role. If you were able to write an 11th chapter of your book, now it's been about 2 years,
Yeah.
what would that 11th chapter be on?
Oh, geez. I think you warned me about this question. I didn't, I don't even know. I think honestly, like, I think that I would have a lot of fun writing a chapter which is essentially about like, don't let your hatred of Donald Trump keep you from the best decision of your life, right? I think
Wow.
that would be the chapter. And I think I would probably have a lot of fun writing that, right? Because it really, the whole point of the title that I chose for the book is to just get people's attention. Say, oh, wow, I didn't know those two things go together, or that's not how, what my perspective is when I go onto Twitter or social media and I look up Bitcoin. So like the word progressive and Bitcoin together. And I just think it'd be, the argument needs to be made that, you know, if you let your hatred of Donald Trump, which a lot of people have, and a lot of people are totally, feel justified in that, right? They're not. I'm not trying to tell them to stop hating Donald Trump, but just don't let your hatred of Donald Trump be in the way of the most important decision that you can make for yourself and your family. That would be the chapter, right? I think that's probably the chapter that we need right now, which we probably didn't need back when I wrote the book originally.
That framework in general, I think, is what we need more than ever right now. Not just with Bitcoin, but with in general as a country, is how do we talk to each other and reach across the aisle and start with what we have in common?
Yeah, and you see it. Like I feel like I've had conversations with people not about Bitcoin, but just generally in politics. And when I say like every single day as a left of center liberal progressive person in this country, like you're reading the news and you're like, I don't want to read the news anymore, right? Like there's no shortage of bad, um, like quote unquote bad news, right? Like from your perspective as a Democrat or progressive or whatever. But I've had conversations with people that say, well, like that thing that he did or that one thing he said isn't totally crazy. I can kind of see where that's coming from. Like that's part of it, right? Is to have that kind of conversation and realize that there might be little glimmers that make sense. Or, like, when Trump came into office and, like just signed a million executive orders on day one, like I didn't like any of them, but like the idea that he did that is something I can kind of get behind, like go try to do something, right? So like there's little moments where you can say, all right, well, this is where there's a toehold in a conversation that might get us to the next level. Not that you have to agree with everything he's doing or that you shouldn't be super cautious, but just to have an open conversation and be willing to say, all right, well, I know that you don't like this, but like, why don't you like it? Or are there any parts that you do that you can tolerate or that you do like? I think that's part of the conversation, or needs to be for sure.
Hmm.
I'm
We
wondering,
had, go ahead, Kate.
okay.
Sorry.
I'm wondering if there's almost an element of fun that seems to be missing from Bitcoin. Do you notice that? Like if people are usually attracted to spaces that are positive and, you're seeing movement of change and all of these things. Do you think there's an element of fun that's missing from Bitcoin?
Um, yeah, I think there is, and you can find it, right? There's like the funny memes and the little cartoons for kids, like there, it's out there. But I think that uh, you're you're right to ask that because I feel like Bitcoin is so complicated, and you just never stop learning about it and all of that, right? Like if I imagine if I taught calculus the way that Bitcoin is sort of being represented online, like, people would just change the channel, right? And if you live in America and you have a debit card that works and your bank isn't going to freeze your funds, then changing the channel is like very low cost, like response to all of that. So having a little bit of fun with it, and I guess I'll say just from my perspective, like the kind of fun that speaks to the people in my target audience, right? There's a lot of people who make jokes or make claims or I can't even tell if they're serious anymore or not, right? About only eating meat and like all of the things that happen in the Bitcoin space. Like maybe those people think that's fun, but that would turn off somebody in my target audience. Like who are you getting involved with, Jason? Like what are these people talking about, right? And so maybe just a different kind of fun. Like I definitely think the people that are talking about like sun tanning all their private parts and eating steak only, like they're having a blast, right? But it's
Yeah.
definitely not my target audience, right? So I feel like we need to maybe have a different kind of fun. So it's a good question, and I do think like learning. Like the research shows, like you learn things better if there's an emotional stake in it, and that emotional stake could be anything from like fear to I'm having a blast and laughing and having a good time, right? But there needs to be some sort of emotional component to it. And that's one of the favorite parts that I have of being in a classroom in front of a room of teenagers who are there because they kind of have to be, but it's my job to teach them calculus or algebra 2, is to figure out what's gonna do it for them, what's gonna get them interested. And I tell lots of jokes in class. I have lots of stories, and sometimes they just roll their eyes at me, and sometimes they actually laugh. Maybe they're just being polite. But the whole point is like I can't just sit there and be dry about it the whole time. That's not going to work. So I think that yeah, we need to have more fun.
I'd love to talk a little bit more about yourself as the teacher in the classroom. What are the jokes you say? I mean, is it connected to the curriculum? What's the kind of ratio, the time you spend on classroom management, developing the learning environment, the rapport with the kids, just to kind of start those emotional connections that then you can
Yeah,
deliver the content for, right?
nobody's really ever asked me about this in like a Bitcoin themed interview. And I'll say like the ratio of like time you spent building community versus teaching is way off from what most people would probably guess, right? On like the first week of class, it's like 90% building an environment, right? And that's just like my relationship with the kids' relationship with each other, setting ground rules that we all kind of can abide by and understand, right? And it's something as simple as, like really catching and calling out, like if one kid makes a mistake and another kid makes a joke, even if it's lighthearted and like well intended, or they're good buddies outside of the classroom, like calling that out and saying, we're not going to do that in this class, right? We're all on the same team. We're all learning math together. Nobody since Isaac Newton has learned calculus by themselves, and this is your team right now, right? So like really building that community from day one in the first couple of like days of class is super important. But it's funny, right? Because teenagers in a calculus classroom, if they can kind of sense that they're going to ask you a question and get you off topic, they're going to do it, right? And so Bitcoin for me is like one of the things that they're going to ask about as
Huh.
often as they can, because they know like I could probably talk about it for the full 45 minutes. And oh look, I can't give you homework, right? Because we didn't cover anything. So it's something. It's a balance, right? You have to kind of get a good sense of what you're doing, but like I'll talk to the kids about what they're interested in, what sports are they playing that afternoon. I'm a big proponent of realizing that their 45 minutes in math class is not the most important part of their day. They need to be there for that 45 minutes. But I understand they're going to a different class after mine, and then another class, and then lunch, and then, playing sports and then hanging out with friends, and all of that stuff is more important to them than my class. And I get that. And if you have that right perspective, then you can kind of maybe make a connection with them about something else that's important. It's funny. I'll tell jokes all the time, just like, I don't know, just in conversational jokes, and or make references, like, which is hilarious to me because I'll make a reference and the kids have no idea what I'm talking about because I'm much older than them. And I do have a class. It's actually the class I teach in this room where this kid goes, Mr. Mayor, I feel like your references that you make are probably always good, even if we don't understand them all the time, because sometimes after class I look them up and they're really funny. So, it's just like this observation that yeah, when I'm like when I'm referencing a movie from 1999, like these kids aren't going to get it, but like if they go
Yeah.
look it up, they'll appreciate the joke, right? And it's not really for them; it's kind of for me, and to kind of make things lighthearted. But yeah. So it's good. It's a good question, right? I feel like that I talk about my classroom a lot, like a mathematical community, and making sure that people are all on the same page and that they feel comfortable, because you can't learn things if you're not comfortable. And if you log into Twitter and you're trying to learn about Bitcoin and people are using words or talking about concepts or having political stances that are way different from yours, then you're not going to feel comfortable. And that's really sort of why I wrote the book. Like, how am I going to go to a colleague of mine who I know, um, you know, believes in vaccines and global warming and talk to them about Bitcoin if all of the resources are going to call you an idiot for thinking vaccines protect you from diseases and global warming is real? Like, if you're being called names or you're just not comfortable in that space, you're not going to be able to learn. So same with the math classroom, same with Bitcoin.
I think that's a huge takeaway for this conversation is what environment are we inviting outsiders into? And is it inviting? I wanted to tag onto your point about in the classroom, because I have 17 years of experience teaching in
Yeah.
the classroom. So when you mentioned that point about kids wanting to derail the conversation as much as possible,
Yeah.
it kind of reminds me of the Bitcoiner laser eyes, right? Like,
Mm.
have you ever posted a picture of laser eye Jason?
I think once, yeah. I
Yeah.
don't think I'd still up there though, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of it runs parallel, right? Like, stay on task, stay focused,
Right.
don't miss the mark.
And multiple times this year, I've had a kid come up to me like before the bell rings, say, "Okay, I want to ask you about Michael Saylor." I'm like, "Not now. We're not talking about that. Like,
Yeah,
we're doing unit 3.2 right now. We're not talking about Michael Saylor." So
yeah.
it happens all the time. Yeah,
For a time, I had Michael Saylor's 10 rules for life or whatever
yeah.
posted in the classroom.
Yeah, yeah. And
Yeah,
there's lots of ways to incorporate Bitcoin authentically into a high school math classroom, right? And like one time a student asked me, how does note because like if you study mathematics, like notation has changed, right? Like through the centuries, what we agree on, like things like parentheses or the equal sign or what the square root symbol looks like, the actual thing you write down on the paper changes through the centuries. And the question, well, who decides that, right? Like who is there somebody who says, all right, well, this is what the equal sign looks like right now? And it spun off into this great conversation about consensus and decentralization, and nobody's in charge of it. And you have to provide something that's better than the alternative. And like people need to believe why it works, and that needs to sort of take off. So it was like, and then all of a sudden we're just talking about math symbols. And then somebody's like, are you talking about Bitcoin also right now? I was like, well, I'm just talking about decentralization and consensus, so it's just like there's moments like that that pop up that you can actually incorporate in an authentic way. You're not sort of like stretching it and just bring up Bitcoin just because you want to bring up Bitcoin.
so I wanted to, I guess, to bring it back to adoption. We
Yeah.
had Troy Cross on. He was our first guest in January, and he was talking about, how reluctant academics are to adopt Bitcoin. And I said, well, why don't you like lean into that more and like try to get more of them on board? And he kind of laughed and he laid out kind of a framework for how Bitcoin gets adopted. So I wanted to run this by you and
Okay.
get your thoughts on it, because
Yeah.
he said obviously like the first adopters of Bitcoin are going to be Wall Street and the financial players because they have skin in the game. And then as they, I guess, signal more to it, you're going to have media and journalists, validating that narrative, right? And pushing that narrative. That then can then lead to the more broader middle class adoption. And then the final holdouts, the last ones, will be the ivory tower academics.
Yeah. So on first blush, I think that Troy's probably right. And there's a caveat to that. I think that there's an exception. But you're right. Like I think that ivory tower academics who are working at like elite colleges and universities who get paid to do research about like a thing that they're supposed to know are not incentivized to branch out and explore different alternatives or to go like cut against the widely held public opinion, right? And we go back to what I said earlier, right? If the widely held public opinion is money plus internet plus complicated, you dismiss it, then like people like Bitcoin is still kind of a joke in these circles, right? Like, oh well, ha ha ha. Like, no, I just said the word Bitcoin and that wasn't the punchline, right? That wasn't the joke. Like, I'm actually serious about this, right? And I feel like that's the kind of the reaction that I get working at a high school level. I think Troy probably gets something similar going on in college. And so there's just the incentives aren't there, right? Like I feel like the media eventually is sort of second wave adopters, and I think the politicians have something to gain right now. So that's why you're seeing it in the political sphere. The media has something to gain because it's sort of a new kind of interesting thing. And so if you can find the media now that is doing and publishing resources about Bitcoin that is going against that sort of like baseline assumption that it's a scam. And that's really interesting because like there's actually a story to be told there. And so like, journalists and media might be incentivized to do it. The professors who think that they understand economics and that their whole career is built on it, or that maybe their specialty is in some completely unrelated field, like I feel like there's not really an incentive there to go out on a limb and risk looking foolish, right? Because that's their capital is their reputation. And so I agree with Troy on all of that, all of those fronts. I think that the exception is if you want to understand how money works, you need to talk to philosophers and sociologists. And so, like Troy is a philosopher, he's a philosophy professor. We have Resistance Money out, which was written by three philosophy professors, three different ones. And so, like, you have some academic work that could be done in a respected way about like what is money, why does it work, like how does Bitcoin fit into that picture. And that could happen not from like professors, PhDs in economics, but philosophers and people who are study this as a subset of sociology, like because money is like a social contract and a thing that we all use in society, right? Money doesn't exist without society. So I feel like those are the two exceptions where you can say, okay, well, now I have a novel piece of research. I can get it published. People will take it seriously because it's not totally dismantling the entire like field of economics. It's just sort of studying how are humans as social animals interacting with this new thing called Bitcoin, and how does that connect to other definitions of money? Or philosophically, you can kind of do the same thing, and that's why Troy is. I don't think Troy is suffering professionally in his world of academia because people know he's into Bitcoin. But if he was like an economics professor instead of a philosophy professor, I don't know that that would be the case. So I feel like Troy's overall conclusion that you summarized for me sounds about right. But there's a couple of important caveats there, and I'm grateful that we're seeing things like Resistance Money out as a thorough, peer-reviewed, like huge piece of information for people who, if they actually do have an open mind in academia, can actually read a book and learn from it. So.
Okay, I know we're getting toward the end here. So let's bring it back to maybe politics and adoption, like the framework you have. So in your circle, people who are passionate about Bitcoin adoption, we recognize that there's an entire subset of Bitcoiners, of soon to be or possibly like could be Bitcoiners within the progressive wing. What are the next steps? Because as you mentioned, it was kind of easier a year and a half ago than it is now to have those conversations. So
yeah,
are we like in a wait and hold period right now? Like, what do you think the next steps are?
No, I think that there's a lot of good work being done already, and will continue to be, right? So I think that first and foremost, the Progressive Bitcoiner podcast has now branched out into a completely certified nonprofit organization. So if we're thinking about who's the target audience and how to get people on board and how to have those difficult conversations in sort of the age of Trump plus Bitcoin, the Progressive Bitcoiner Inc. is probably the like dollar for dollar, Bitcoin for Bitcoin, sat for sat, the best place to go in order to support that cause, right? Because I have the pleasure of serving on the board. Trey Walsh was the one-time host of the podcast. He's now the executive something on the board. I messed it up. I apologize. But and Mark Stefani is the president of the organization. So you have people who are mission aligned. Their goal is to convince liberal, progressive, left of center people that Bitcoin can make the world a better place. And we've set up this organization to do just that, right? To educate people, to get Bitcoin out there doing good in the world. Just even, the idea of donating to a cause that is worthy of getting support, like financial support for this cause, even if it's not a Bitcoin cause, but the good is coming from Bitcoiners who are donating to this nonprofit, and the nonprofit is deciding, you know what, we want to help this person get healthcare that they can't get in their state, and we're going to, donate money to do that, or a lot of other examples too. So I feel like that's one thing that A1A, if I had to say something, is that we have a small but dedicated group of people who are mission aligned with what I'm trying to do, which is to get sort of middle of the road pre-coiners, liberal people who would dismiss Bitcoin normally, have a serious, real conversation or educate about it or get it in the spotlight for doing good in the world, then the progressive Bitcoiner is the way to go. The other thing is that there's a lot of legitimately non-political or non-partisan organizations. You know, the Bitcoin Policy Institute is having their summit today in Washington, D.C. And, you know, I think that there's a lot of people and organizations and groups in Bitcoin that claim to be sort of nonpartisan, but slip in their sort of partisan ideals. But I do think that the Bitcoin Policy Institute is an absolutely amazing resource that we have, and people like Troy work with them, and a lot of others too. So I feel like the direct connection to politics and to politicians in Washington, D.C. and beyond is, you know, people are doing that work. And it doesn't have to be in a let's focus on Democrats, let's make it, you know, liberal thing. It can just literally be, let's just not make it a partisan thing. Let's just talk about Bitcoin, the technology, or how it can intersect with our governance, or how it can make the world a better place. So there's people out there doing good work. And I think that, you know, Bitcoiners who are serious about this need to decide how they're going to help support the next wave of adoption, the next wave of understanding of what Bitcoin is. And even if you yourself aren't a progressive person, but you do care about the future of Bitcoin and its adoption and how it sits within the United States in particular, it would be foolish to think that we can just have only right-wing, only libertarian, only conservative people in Bitcoin, and that's not fragile, right? If we want to become anti-fragile, we need to broaden the coalition. We need to protect our left flank. We need to kind of make sure that we have politicians of all varieties supporting us, voters of all varieties supporting us. Because I'll tell you, if you need to hear it from me, I'll say it. Like, you're not going to convince people to become libertarian and then adopt Bitcoin. Like, it's not going to work in that order. So if you want to convince people to get into Bitcoin and to understand why it's going to make the world a better place, you got to speak their language. You're not going to convert them all to be, Ron Paul lovers, and then they're going to find Bitcoin. It's not going to work like that. So, that's what I'll say. And maybe that's a surprise to people. Maybe they really truly think like, oh, we're going to win all of this because everyone's just going to become a libertarian and then they're going to fall in love with Bitcoin. If that's sort of how people are thinking, then I need to disabuse them of that notion. It's not how it's going to play out. So,
wow.
What do you think happens if progressives or left-leaning people don't adopt Bitcoin? What is the risk there?
Yeah, I think one risk is to the liberals and progressives, right? Like, not adopting Bitcoin is a problem for them. It means they're going to have fewer resources, less influence, you know, all of that stuff. So I feel like that's true. Like, liberals need Bitcoin, and I will say there's a secondary risk too of, you know, Bitcoin is going to be fine, but it might not be fine. That doesn't mean it's going to be fine in America. And it doesn't mean that, like, people who have the power, political, financial, economic power, can't make life as a Bitcoiner in America really, really hard. And so if we just create a bunch of enemies over the next 4 years, then Democrats find themselves in the Oval Office after this. My hope would be that we can develop a Bitcoin policy that can withstand that next, administration. Like, people will be on board. And so I do feel like Bitcoin will be fine, but the people that I know and I care about and are in my community, I would like to see Bitcoin sort of grow bottom up, or at least have a wide coalition of support, because I do think that there's a risk of it becoming hyper politicized, only for those other people. And the first thing I have to do when I get into power is to get rid of it, or to do choke point 3.0, or to make it, to try to use my influence to change public opinion so it's not taken seriously. Like, all of those are real dangers. It's not a danger to, like, the Bitcoin network, but it is a danger to adoption. And if you feel like, well, I'm only here for number go up, or the price is going to moon, or all of that stuff, well, that takes more people buying Bitcoin or understanding it and using it. So if we're just sort of intentionally shutting out half of the population, I don't think that's going to go well for anybody. And I'm under no illusions, like, progressives need Bitcoin more than Bitcoin needs progressives. But It's not like we're at a point now where, like it's free sailing and everything's going to be really easy if we make enemies of half of the people in the country.
Right.
Yeah.
And do you think adoption in third world countries actually helps advance the view of Bitcoin for progressives?
I do, yeah, and that's one of the downsides of the strategic reserve, right? At least in theory, the price is supposed to go up when all these nation states are competing to buy Bitcoin. And like one of the things that really is distasteful about that for me is like we're pricing out people that actually need it in their home countries who need the technology because they're being censored or repressed, or their life saving is being inflated away. Like all of those are real use cases for people that need it, and less so for on all of those counts for Americans. And so that's just another reason why, hey, like a Bitcoin strategic reserve from the bottom up, grassroots support, push the politicians to it, makes sense in 8 to 12 years, because it kind of gives the rest of the world a chance to get on board a little bit. It also is a great sort of um, uh, teaching mechanism for people. Like I said, like not everybody cares about topic X, Y, or Z, but the more people we have who are using Bitcoin to make their lives better, to fight authoritarian leadership, and to like donate to money to people that need it around the world, like all of those are great examples of Bitcoin. And the more of those that we have, the better. And it's going to help educate and get people on board.
Wow. Well said. Well, I think we have time for one more question. And
Sure.
I've saved the hardest one for last. And that
Okay.
is, when you are not in the classroom and you're not talking about Bitcoin, what else are you into?
That's a great question. So I coach golf here, so I'm a golfer. That's just something I do for fun. I like to go to the gym also, and I'm a parent. My latest project, I haven't told anybody this. You guys have an exclusive scoop here. My latest project I've been working on over the last couple of months has been to develop a brand new strategy board game, which is the nerdiest thing in the world that you could possibly do. It's all about the history of mathematics. And so it's sort of like marrying my love of strategy board games, which I reference in my Bitcoin book, but mathematics. So it's totally nerdy thing, but I like it. And the best thing about that is that it's Bitcoin adjacent in the sense that it's mathematics, but there's like a little Bitcoin Easter egg within the strategy board game. And it's not like a Bitcoin board game, and it's not like, oh, look at Bitcoin. It's just like Bitcoin is mentioned in a very normal, hey, this is something that mathematicians use, just like these other tools that mathematicians use. It's not special, it's on a pedestal, and there's no like crazy hyperbolic language behind it. It's just normal. And I feel like you asked me about like not Bitcoin, and I brought it back to Bitcoin, but I think that's like the number one thing that we need to do, is just to start having normal conversations with people where Bitcoin isn't the punchline to a joke, or it's not some hyperbolic thing where you're just like, oh, I just met you for the first time, I think we should end the Fed. Like that's not the first conversation you should have with people, right? So just start talking about Bitcoin in a normal way. Like it's not a joke, it's just something that people use, right? And so that's why I was very intentional when I designed my whole like nerdy strategy board game about the history of mathematics. And like there's Euclid on one end, and there's, modern mathematicians on the other end, like, and there's an abacus and a compass. And then on this end, there's Bitcoin, and it's just normal, just like the abacus and pocket calculator are normal, and we're not going to get political about it. Like Bitcoin is just there too. So I feel like that's the key, right? We just need to get it more normalized, so it's not like, oh, that's something I get to laugh at now because you just mentioned Bitcoin, or you're kind of a crackpot weirdo who believes in conspiracy theories because you just mentioned Bitcoin. We need to get over that hump, and we're definitely not there yet. But that's my hope.
Amazing.
Awesome. I have one more question if we have time. It'll be quick.
Yeah, no problem.
What's the best piece of advice you have for someone who would be interested in writing a book, whether it's about Bitcoin or not?
Yeah, great question. Writing, sit down and write. Like, I think that you need to write something every day. And for me, that meant adhering to a pretty strict schedule. Like, that's how I work. Like, I pretty much like I'm on or off on things. That's a blessing and a curse. But I decided that I was going to wake up at 5 o'clock every morning and spend 2.5 hours before my kids woke up, and sit in a windowless room half the time I sat on my porch if it was nice out, and just write and really worry about the editing and making it good later. Just get it down on paper, or like I began my book, literally I was sick in bed with COVID, and I just grabbed my laptop and I started writing in a Google document. That's how I started writing the book. So I feel like the number one advice is set a schedule that works for you. It might not be 5 a.m. Be surprised if it is, but and just start writing, and then let it go from there. I think that's the number one key. Don't worry about it being good, and don't worry about like, oh, I need to write a certain amount every day or every week. Just set a schedule that you can stick with and do it. And then just keep asking for help, right? Like, please read this. Tell me how I can make it better. Does this make sense to you? Where is it confusing? Just keep asking for help. So.
Fantastic, Jason. What a great conversation. Thanks so much for being here and sharing your insights and experience. There's a lot of good things for us to think about from this show. Thank you.
No, I appreciate it. Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate that.
Nice. Well, I'll take a little minute to drive everyone to follow Jason if you're not already. See Jason Mayer on X. And what other websites should we be guiding people toward?
So there's information about my book at bitcoinprogressive.com, and the nonprofit that I mentioned earlier that's going to be doing a lot of good work, and it's newly incorporated as a nonprofit, is theprogressivebitcoiner.org. So go there, look at what they're doing. We're pushing out articles and information, and you can donate. You can donate in Bitcoin, and make the world a better place. So thank you.
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you for everyone tuning into the show. We really appreciate it. Share this conversation out so we can get as many supporters behind Jason as possible. I also want to plug Good for Bitcoin coming up this Friday, and we'll be back again next Tuesday, as always, 11 a.m. Eastern. Thanks again, everyone. We'll see you next time.
Our outro does not want to play. Give me one moment.
Sure. There it is. Thanks again for joining us in the Leather Lounge. We record each episode live every Tuesday at 11 a.m. Eastern. And if you'd like to listen in or join us on stage, make sure to give us a follow on X at LeatherBTC. Leather is your gateway to everything Bitcoin, from DeFi to stacks, ordinals, runes, stamps, NFTs, and more. You can find loads of helpful crypto content on our YouTube channel and visit our blog and learn center at leather.io.